This story delves into themes of psychological distress, supernatural phenomena, and intense fear. Listener discretion is advised. It started with the cold, not the kind that makes you shiver from a draft, but a deep, bone-aching chill that radiated from the corners of my living room, even when the thermostat was cranked. Then came the whispers, barely audible, just at the edge of hearing, always when I was alone. Now, months later, I sleep with the lights on, a baseball bat by my bed, and a knot of pure terror in my stomach that never loosens. We went looking for a ghost, and we found it. The problem? It didn't stay where we found it. My name is David. I used to be a skeptic, or at least I thought I was. I'd watch those ghost hunting shows, scoffing at every shadow and creak, convinced it was all elaborate fakery or wishful thinking. Like most people, I believed in what I could see, what I could touch, what science could explain. That was before the Blackwood Sanatorium, before the silence became a scream, and the shadows learned to move. It was Michael's idea, of course. Michael, with his boundless energy and insatiable appetite for anything that promised an adrenaline rush. He'd been obsessed with urban exploration for years, dragging our group into abandoned factories, derelict schools, and forgotten tunnels. But this was different. This was Blackwood. The Blackwood Sanatorium wasn't just another crumbling building. It was a local legend, a dark stain on the landscape of our small New England town. Built in the early 1900s, it was originally a facility for tuberculosis patients, a place where people went to die slowly and painfully, often far from their families. As medical science advanced, its purpose shifted to psychiatric care, and that's when the truly disturbing stories began. Whispers of experimental treatments, unethical procedures, and patients who simply vanished. The sanatorium closed abruptly in the late 70s, its doors padlocked, its secrets left to rot within its decaying walls. Locals called it the Whispering Asylum, claiming you could still hear the cries of the lost souls trapped inside. Michael had been talking about Blackwood for months. It's the ultimate challenge, guys, he'd insisted over pizza one Friday night. Every urban explorer's wet dream, and nobody's ever spent a full night in there. Not really. Not and come back sane. Emily, ever the pragmatist, had rolled her eyes. Michael, it's just an old building, probably full of rats and asbestos. And tetanus. Jessica, who loved a good mystery novel and had a soft spot for anything spooky, was intrigued. But think of the history, Emily. All those lives, all that suffering. It's bound to leave an imprint, right? Jessica was our resident empath, always feeling things just a little deeper than the rest of us. And me? I was on the fence. Part of me, the rational part, agreed with Emily. It was probably dangerous, illegal, and ultimately boring. But another part, a part one hadn't known existed until Michael started talking, was undeniably curious. The allure of the forbidden, the thrill of stepping into a place steeped in so much grim history, was a powerful draw. What exactly would we do in there, Michael? I asked. Just wander around? No, man, he exclaimed, his eyes alight. We'd document it. We'd take photos, maybe some video. We'd look for signs, cold spots, strange noises, anything that proves the legends. We'd be ghost hunters for real. He paused, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. And yeah, we'd try to spend the night. Just to say we did. The idea was insane. We weren't professional ghost hunters. We were a graphic designer, a teacher, a nurse, and a software engineer. Our closest brush with the supernatural was watching horror movies on Netflix. But Michael's enthusiasm was infectious, and Jessica's curiosity was a strong current. Emily, despite her initial skepticism, eventually relented, mostly out of a protective urge to keep Michael from doing anything too stupid alone. And me? I figured it would be a story to tell, a harmless adventure, maybe even a chance to debunk some local myths. So, a few weeks later, armed with flashlights, a cheap digital camera, a thermal imager Michael had borrowed from a friend, and a healthy dose of bravado, we found ourselves standing at the edge of the overgrown woods that surrounded the Blackwood Sanatorium. It was late afternoon on a crisp autumn day, the kind of day where the air itself felt heavy with secrets. The trees, their leaves blazing in reds and golds, seemed to part reluctantly, revealing the looming decrepit structure. Blackwood was immense, a sprawling brick edifice with countless broken windows that stared out like empty eye sockets. Vines thick as ropes snaked their way up the walls, reclaiming the building piece by piece. The silence was the first thing that struck me, not just quiet, but a profound, oppressive absence of sound. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the leaves, just a heavy, deafening stillness that seemed to swallow every faint crunch of our boots on the fallen leaves. "Creepy," Jessica whispered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Even Michael, usually boisterous, was subdued. We found an unsecured service entrance, a rusty metal door hanging precariously on one hinge. A blast of cold, stale air, smelling of dust, decay, and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic and faintly sweet, hit us as we pushed it open. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the absolute darkness. The interior was a labyrinth of peeling paint, shattered glass, and forgotten medical equipment. Gurneys lay overturned, wheelchairs sat in silent rows, their seats rotted away. Syringes and medical vials littered the floor, glinting eerily in our flashlight beams. The air was thick with airborne particles making us cough. "This place is incredible," Michael breathed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the vast space. He was already snapping photos, his excitement returning. Emily was more cautious, her flashlight sweeping every corner, checking for structural integrity. Jessica walked slowly, her head tilted, as if listening to something beyond our hearing. We wandered through abandoned patient rooms, their beds long gone, leaving behind only the faded imprints on the floor. We passed through examination rooms, a desolate cafeteria, and what looked like an old operating theater, its tiled walls stained with something dark and unsettling. Each room seemed to hold its own particular brand of desolation. As we moved deeper, the temperature noticeably dropped. It wasn't a gradual cooling, but distinct pockets of intense cold that would suddenly envelop us, raising goosebumps on our arms before dissipating just as quickly. "Did you feel that?" Emily asked, rubbing her arms. "It's like someone left a freezer door open." "Thermal imager, Michael," Jessica urged. He quickly brought out the device, its screen glowing with heat signatures. But in the spots where we felt the cold, the screen registered nothing but deep blues and purples, indicating temperatures significantly lower than the surrounding air. "Whoa," Michael murmured, his previous bravado momentarily replaced by genuine awe. That's not normal." We continued, drawn by an invisible current, until we reached the psychiatric wing. This section felt different, heavier. The whispers, which had been a faint, almost imagined presence since we entered, seemed to intensify here, a low murmur just beneath the threshold of hearing. It was like walking through a static-filled radio channel. We found a locked room at the very end of a long, dark corridor. The door, unlike the others, was made of reinforced steel, with a small barred window at eye level. Scratches, deep and frantic, marred the inside of the door, as if someone had desperately tried to claw their way out. A chill colder than any we'd felt yet emanated from it. "What do you think was in here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jessica pressed her ear to the door, her face pale. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But it feels angry. So much pain." Michael, ever the thrill-seeker, tried the handle. It was locked, of course, but then to our collective shock we heard it. A faint, distinct scratching sound from inside the room. It wasn't the sound of rats, or crumbling plaster. It was rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across metal. We froze, our flashlights fixed on the door. The scratching stopped. Then a single guttural moan, low and drawn out, seemed to vibrate through the very walls. It was a sound of absolute despair, of ancient suffering. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a trick of the light or a creaking pipe. This was something else. Something real. "Okay," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. "That's enough. We need to go." Michael for once didn't argue. His face was ashen. We turned to leave, but as we did, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow detached itself from the wall near the locked door. It wasn't solid, more like a ripple in the air, a distortion of light. It drifted silently towards us, growing larger, its edges indistinct. And as it passed through where Jessica was standing, she gasped, a strangled sound, and stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. "It touched me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It felt like ice. And pure hatred." We didn't need any more convincing. We bolted, scrambling through the dark corridors, our flashlights dancing wildly, the oppressive silence now filled with the pounding of our own feet and the ragged sound of our breathing. We didn't look back. We just ran. We thought we had escaped. We thought we had left the horrors of Blackwood Sanatorium behind us. But we were wrong. So terribly, terribly wrong. The burning in our lungs was a cruel counterpoint to the icy dread in our hearts. We stumbled through the dense undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes, the rough terrain unforgiving beneath our frantic steps. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounded like footsteps behind us, like the slow, deliberate approach of the ancient evil we had just provoked. The air grew colder the further we ran, or perhaps it was just the sheer terror chilling us to the bone. We burst out of the tree line, gasping, into the gravel parking lot where our old sedan sat, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. David, bless his quick thinking, had left the keys in the ignition, and the doors unlocked. We piled in, scrambling over each other, a tangle of limbs and panicked breaths. David slammed the door shut, the sound echoing ominously in the silent night, then fumbled the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a symphony of salvation. He jammed the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel as we peeled out of the lot, leaving the looming silhouette of Blackwood Sanatorium shrinking in the rearview mirror. No one spoke. Jessica was sobbing quietly in the back seat, her face buried in Emily's shoulder. Emily, usually the most composed of us, was rigid, staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. I sat next to David, my knuckles white as I gripped the dashboard, every fiber of my being screaming at us to go faster, to put as much distance as humanly possible between us and that place. David's eyes were locked on the road, his jaw clenched, his face pale in the faint glow of the dashboard lights. We drove for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only 30 minutes, before the first signs of civilization appeared. A distant gas station, then a few scattered houses. With each mile, the suffocating grip of fear loosened, replaced by a fragile, almost hysterical relief. We were safe. We had made it. Are we okay? Jessica's voice was a whisper, raw and broken. David nodded, though his hand still trembled on the wheel. Yeah, Jess. We're okay. We're out. We're never talking about this again, Emily stated, her voice surprisingly firm, though it still held a tremor. Never. Not a word. We all agreed, a silent, desperate pact. We wanted to believe it. We wanted to believe that the horrors of Blackwood Sanatorium were confined to its crumbling walls, that the spectral presence we had encountered, the chilling whispers, the inexplicable cold, were all left behind, locked away in that desolate place. But as David turned onto the main highway, the relief began to curdle, flicker. Just for a split second, in the rearview mirror I saw something. A shadow darker than the night, briefly coalesce in the backseat, right where Jessica and Emily were huddled. It was amorphous, indistinct, but it was there, like a blot of ink on black velvet. I blinked, my heart hammering against my ribs again. It was gone. Just the reflection of the passing streetlights, or my own exhaustion playing tricks on my eyes. Did anyone see that? I asked, my voice barely a croak. Jessica flinched. Emily slowly turned her head, her eyes scanning the back seat. David glanced up at the mirror. See what, Michael? David asked, his brow furrowed. Nothing, I quickly corrected, shaking my head. Just tired. Long night. A long night indeed. We dropped Emily off first, her house a welcome sight in the suburban quiet. She gave us a weak smile, a silent promise to stick to our pact, and disappeared inside. Then David, who lived alone, drove off to his own place, still looking shaken but trying to project an air of normalcy. Jessica and I lived together, and the familiar street, the porch light, the comforting shape of our home, felt like a sanctuary. We stumbled inside, the silence of our apartment feeling strangely heavy. The warmth of the heater, the familiar scent of our lingering dinner, none of it could completely dispel the lingering chill from the sanatorium. Jessica went straight to the shower, needing to wash away the grime and the terror. I made myself a mug of hot tea, my hand still shaking slightly as I poured the water. The adrenaline was slowly draining, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a gnawing unease. I tried to convince myself that the shadow in the mirror was just my imagination, a trick of the light brought on by fear and lack of sleep. That's all it could have been. Rationality was my only shield against the creeping dread. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible from the living room. Sounded like a name. My name. I froze, the teacup halfway to my lips. Jessica. I called out, my voice tight. No answer, just the distant sound of the shower running. I slowly walked into the living room, my eyes scanning the familiar space. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The worn sofa, the bookshelves packed with novels, the framed photos on the mantel. Nothing out of place. No open windows, no drafts. But the air in the center of the room was noticeably colder, a distinct pocket of icy air that raised goosebumps on my arms. And then, a framed photo on the mantel, one of Jessica and me from our college graduation, slowly, almost deliberately, turned itself face down. My breath hitched. My teacup clattered onto the coffee table, sloshing hot liquid onto the wood. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an old house settling. This was deliberate. I stared at the overturned photo, my mind racing, trying to find any logical explanation. An earthquake? No, nothing else moved. A vibration from a passing truck? Unlikely to affect only one specific item so precisely. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time, right behind my ear. Not my name, but a low guttural murmur, utterly devoid of human warmth, like gravel scraping against bone. An ancient, sorrowful sound. The very same sound we had heard echoing in the desolate halls of Blackwood. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the empty air. But the cold spot was still there. And it felt like a presence. An invisible weight pressing down on the space where I'd stood. I backed away slowly, my eyes wide, until my back hit the wall. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't fatigue. This was real. And it was here. Just then, Jessica emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping wet. She looked a little better, the color returning to her cheeks, but her eyes still held a haunted look. "Hey," she said, her voice softer now. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She chuckled, a weak, nervous sound. I could only point a trembling finger at the overturned photo. "Jess, I heard something." And then it just moved. Her eyes widened as she followed my gaze to the mantel. Her tentative smile vanished. "Michael, what are you talking about?" Before I could explain, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the text. It was from Emily. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered, her face draining of color again. "Emily just texted. She said she went to bed, and when she woke up for a glass of water, all the curtains in her living room were open, and the window was wide open too. She swears she locked it. And she said she keeps hearing someone humming an old lullaby, very faintly, from her kitchen." A cold dread settled deep in my stomach. The humming. We had heard that humming in the sanatorium. A chilling, mournful tune that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jessica looked at me, her eyes filled with a terror that mirrored my own. "Michael, do you think?" She couldn't finish the sentence. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed David. He picked up on the third ring, his voice gruff, clearly annoyed at being woken. "What is it, Michael?" "I just got to sleep." "David, listen to me," I said, my voice urgent. "Did anything weird happen at your place? Anything at all?" There was a pause, a long, unsettling silence. Then David sighed, a sound of frustration mixed with something else. "Look, I'm not usually one for this stuff, you know that. But yeah, something's off. I came home, crashed on the couch. Woke up a few minutes ago because I swear I heard someone scratching at my bedroom door, like fingernails on wood. I thought it was just the house settling or a branch against the window, but then I went to check in my framed college diploma, the one on the wall, it was tilted, like someone had deliberately messed with it. And it's heavy, Michael. It wouldn't just tilt on its own." My blood ran cold. Scratching, humming, overturned objects, the shadow in the mirror. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't our imagination. It followed us, Jessica whispered, her voice trembling, finally articulating the terrifying truth we had all been subconsciously fighting. The ghost, it followed us home. The cold in our apartment intensified, prickling my skin, and for a fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, just beyond Jessica's shoulder. A tall, gaunt figure, impossibly thin, standing in the doorway to our bedroom. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were bottomless pits of despair. It wasn't just a shadow or a whisper anymore. It was here. It was watching. And it was smiling. Or at least it felt like it was. A silent, terrifying, malevolent smile. We weren't safe. Not in our homes. Not anywhere. The horrors of Blackwood Sanatorium had indeed followed us. And it was only just beginning. The realization hit us like a tidal wave of ice water, each wave colder and more paralyzing than the last. We weren't safe. Not in our homes. Not anywhere. The horrors of Blackwood Sanatorium had indeed followed us. And it was only just beginning. For a few days we tried to deny it, to rationalize. Michael blamed our collective exhaustion, the lingering trauma of the sanatorium. David, ever the pragmatist, searched for logical explanations: old house creaks, faulty wiring, the power of suggestion. Jessica tried to meditate, to clear her mind, convinced it was all in our heads. Emily, though, was the first to break, her voice a thin, reedy whisper over the phone. "It's here, Michael," she choked out late one night. "I keep hearing it. Little whispers, like someone's talking just outside my door. And my photos. All my framed photos, they're turned face down every morning. I know I didn't do it." Her apartment was small, cozy, a sanctuary she carefully curated. The idea of something invading that space, turning her cherished memories away, was a violation. Michael tried to reassure her, to tell her it was probably just her imagination, but even as he spoke the words, he felt a prickle of dread on his own skin. He remembered the feeling of being watched, the cold breath, the impossible smile. Then David called. His voice, usually so steady and analytical, was laced with an unfamiliar tremor. "My smart home system is going haywire," he reported, his words clipped. Lights flickering like a strobe show, the thermostat dropping to 50 degrees in the middle of the night, even though it's set to 70. "And the smell, Michael, this putrid, decaying smell, comes and goes. Like something died in here, but there's nothing." David, the man who meticulously debugged code, was helpless against an unseen force disrupting his meticulously ordered life. He confessed to waking up in a cold sweat, convinced he wasn't alone, that something was standing right beside his bed, breathing. Jessica's experience was more insidious, a slow erosion of her peace. She started having vivid, terrifying nightmares, dreams of being trapped in dark, echoing corridors, pursued by an unseen presence that whispered her name. She'd wake up gasping, her heart hammering, only to find her bedroom door, which she always locked, slightly ajar. Sometimes a single antique-looking button would be left on her pillow, a button she'd never seen before, its surface cold and smooth. It was a persistent psychological torment, slowly chipping away at her composure. And for Michael, it was the shadows. Not just the fleeting peripheral glimpses he'd experienced at the sanatorium, but distinct darker-than-dark shapes that would coalesce in the corners of his vision, only to dissipate when he focused. One evening while making dinner, the entire kitchen went unnervingly silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant city sounds, even his own breathing seemed to vanish. Then a sudden intense drop in temperature, so profound it made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He felt an immense pressure, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on him, forcing the air from his lungs. It lasted only a second, but in that second he knew. He wasn't imagining it. It was real. And it was angry. We couldn't pretend it wasn't happening anymore. The collective terror forced us to finally meet, not at a coffee shop or a park, but at David's apartment, the one with the most advanced security system, ironically. We sat in a tense circle, the air thick with unspoken fear, the flickering of a single lamp casting long, dancing shadows that made us jump at every creak of the floorboards. Emily, pale and drawn, recounted her turned photos, the phantom whispers, the feeling of being watched. Jessica, her eyes heavy-lidded from lack of sleep, described the nightmares, the open door, the chilling presence of the antique button. David, usually so composed, kept glancing nervously at his smart home panel, as if expecting it to betray him again. He detailed the extreme temperature drops, the putrid smell, the inexplicable glitches. And Michael, with a grin set to his jaw, shared his own encounters with the oppressive shadows and the suffocating pressure. "It's not just one of us," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all of us. It followed all of us." "But why?" Emily cried, burying her face in her hands. "What does it want?" David, ever the problem solver, though his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, suggested the only logical next step. "We need to understand it. We need to go back, not physically but through research. There has to be something in Blackwood's history, something we missed, that explains this. A patient, a staff member, an event. Something that gives this thing a name, a reason." Michael nodded, a cold resolve replacing his earlier fear. He knew David was right. Blind panic wouldn't help. Information was their only weapon. "We focus on patient records, staff directories, local newspaper archives from the time Blackwood was operational," he instructed, his voice firm despite the knot of dread in his stomach. "Anything that stands out, anything unusual. We divided the tasks. David, with his unparalleled research skills, began scouring online databases, digitized archives, and obscure historical forums. Jessica, with her knack for observation and detail, focused on cross-referencing names, looking for patterns, connections between different stories. Emily, despite her fear, offered to search local libraries and historical societies for physical records that might not be digitized. Michael took on the broader historical context, looking for any local legends, unsolved mysteries, or strange occurrences linked to the area surrounding the sanatorium. Days bled into a terrifying blur of frantic research and escalating home hauntings. The entity seemed to sense our renewed efforts, our attempt to understand it. The manifestations grew bolder, more aggressive. Emily's apartment was plagued by disembodied crashes and bangs, as if furniture was being thrown around in an unseen tantrum. Jessica found claw marks etched into her wooden bedside table, thin, jagged lines that hadn't been there hours before. David's sophisticated security system began sending him constant, false alarms, often accompanied by chillingly distorted audio feeds, whispers that sounded like a child crying or a low guttural growl. Then, late one night, a week after we'd begun our intensive research, David's voice crackled through Michael's phone, urgent and breathless. "Michael, I found something. Something big." He instructed Michael to come over immediately, to bring Jessica and Emily. They arrived to find David hunched over his multiple monitors, his face illuminated by the eerie glow of the screens, a wild, almost frantic look in his eyes. He motioned for them to gather close, pointing to an old, faded document displayed on his main screen. It was a scanned patient record, dated 1968. "Her name was Eleanor Vance," David began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Admitted to Blackwood Sanatorium at age 8. Diagnosis: severe emotional disturbance and chronic melancholia. Her parents, wealthy but distant, basically dumped her there." Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. 8 years old? They sent an 8-year-old to Blackwood. "It gets worse," David continued, scrolling down the document. "The records indicate she was subjected to experimental treatments for her condition. Early forms of electroshock therapy, prolonged isolation, forced sedation, even some mentions of sensory deprivation experiments." He paused, his finger hovering over a specific line. "And then on October 31st, 1968, she died. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest due to complications from treatment." But there's a handwritten note in the margin, almost illegible, from a nurse. It says, "The child was terrified. She kept seeing things. Said they were coming for her. They took her from us." The room was silent, save for the frantic hum of David's computers. An 8-year-old girl, terrified, experimented on, and left to die in that desolate place. The pieces began to click into place with a horrifying inevitability. The whispers, the child's giggle Emily heard, the small specific acts of mischief, the sheer unrelenting terror. She was trapped there. Emily breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of pity and terror. "And when we disturbed her, we let her out. Or," Michael interjected, his voice grim, "we just opened the door for her to follow us. She was already out, in a way tied to that place. But now she's tied to us." As the last word left his mouth, a piercing, unearthly shriek tore through the silence of David's apartment. It wasn't a human sound, but something ancient and raw, filled with an unimaginable agony and an equally potent rage. The lights in the room flickered violently, then exploded, plunging us into absolute darkness. The air grew impossibly cold, and a sickening, putrid smell filled our nostrils, stronger than anything David had described before. Then from the inky blackness, a child's voice, clear and chillingly close, whispered, "You opened the door. Now you can't close it." We scrambled backwards, our chairs clattering to the floor, our hearts pounding against our ribs like trapped birds. The entity, whatever it was no longer content with subtle hints. It was here in David's apartment, in our midst, and it was furious. We had found Eleanor Vance, but in doing so, we had only deepened our own nightmare. The apartment plunged into an Arctic chill, a cold that didn't just bite at the skin but seemed to seep directly into the bone marrow, icing the very blood in our veins. The air crackled, not with electricity, but with a palpable, invisible pressure that pushed against us, making it difficult to breathe. David, still reeling from the shock of the name, stumbled backward, his hand flying to his chest as if to ward off an unseen blow. The framed photographs on his bookshelf, moments of joy and normalcy, vibrated violently, then one by one they began to slide, crashing to the floor with splintering glass, each shatter echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, terrifying silence. Jessica let out a choked cry, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She scrambled away from the dining table, overturning a chair in her haste, her gaze darting wildly around the room as if expecting to see the source of the chaos materialize before us. Michael, usually the most composed among us, was frozen, his face ashen, his mouth slightly agape. The bravado, the adventurous spirit that had driven us to the Vance house, had completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls, vibrating through the floorboards and up our legs. It wasn't human, not entirely, but it carried an unmistakable undertone of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the sound of a predator cornered, or perhaps a predator unleashed. What is happening?" David stammered, his voice a reedy whisper, barely audible above the escalating cacophony of his apartment coming apart. A heavy antique clock on the mantelpiece spun off its perch, flying across the room to embed itself with a sickening thud into the drywall opposite. Bookshelves groaned, their contents erupting onto the floor in a cascade of paper and binding. The lights flickered, strobing erratically, casting grotesque, dancing shadows that made the familiar living room seem alien and hostile. We were trapped, not by physical barriers, but by an invisible force that held us captive in a tempest of its making. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just the house that was haunted anymore. It was us. Eleanor Vance had followed us home. She was here, and she was making her presence known in the most terrifying way imaginable. "We have to get out," Jessica shrieked, finally breaking her paralysis. She lunged for the door, fumbling with the lock, her fingers trembling so violently she couldn't grasp the mechanism. As she struggled, the doorknob twisted violently in her hand, then spun backward, locking itself with a definitive click. A cold, spectral laugh, high-pitched and bone-chilling, seemed to echo directly inside our heads, a sound that promised endless torment. Michael, snapping out of his stupor, grabbed Jessica, pulling her back from the door. "It's no use. It won't let us leave," he yelled over the escalating chaos. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw genuine despair there. The thrill of the chase, the excitement of discovery, had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality that we had unleashed something we couldn't control. The air grew heavy, thick with a cloying scent, a mix of old dust, decaying flowers, and something metallic like stale blood. It was the smell of the Vance house, now permeating David's clean, modern apartment. It was a violation, a horrifying confirmation that the barrier between their world and ours had not just thinned, it had shattered. We huddled together, three terrified individuals in the center of a room that was systematically being torn apart by an unseen force. David, pale and sweating, pointed a shaking finger towards the kitchen. "Look!" Through the archway we saw it. Knives, forks, and spoons, usually neatly organized in their drawer, began to float, suspended in midair. They clinked together, a macabre chime, before shooting across the kitchen like projectiles, embedding themselves into the walls and ceiling with sickening thuds. A glass pitcher on the counter exploded, shards scattering like deadly confetti. This wasn't just poltergeist activity. This was targeted, malicious destruction, felt personal. "She knows we found her," I whispered, the words barely escaping my throat. "She knows we spoke her name." Michael grabbed his laptop, which had miraculously survived the initial onslaught, and pulled it closer. "We need to find out more. Everything. Why is she so angry? What happened to her after her disappearance?" His fingers flew across the keyboard, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control through information. Jessica, though still visibly shaken, leaned over his shoulder, her mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. David, however, was in a state of near collapse. He sank to the floor, clutching his head. "It's my apartment. It's my fault. I shouldn't have let you bring it here." "It's not your fault, David," I said, trying to reassure him, though my own voice trembled. "We didn't know it would follow us." This was a lie, of course. Deep down, a part of me had always feared this exact outcome. We had disturbed something ancient and vengeful. Michael clicked furiously, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. "Okay, Eleanor Vance. disappeared in 1957. Local police report listed her as a missing person. No foul play suspected initially, but there's an old newspaper archive. Local girl vanishes. Disturbing details emerge. He clicked on the link, and a grainy yellowed article filled the screen. "Read it, Michael, read it," Jessica urged, her voice tight with urgency. Michael began to read aloud, his voice strained but steady. Eleanor Vance, 19, a resident of the infamous Vance estate on Elmwood Lane, vanished from her home on the night of October 27, 1957. Initial police investigations yielded no clues, leading authorities to suspect she may have run away. However, friends and family insist Eleanor was not the type to simply disappear. Her diary, later discovered by her distraught mother, painted a disturbing picture of her final days. A sudden jarring crash from the kitchen made us all jump. The refrigerator door, which had been perfectly closed, now stood ajar, its contents spilling onto the floor. A carton of milk exploded as if squeezed by an invisible hand. Michael pressed on, determined. Her diary entries spoke of a growing paranoia, a feeling of being watched, even within the confines of her own home. She wrote of cold spots and whispers in empty rooms, of objects moving when no one was present. Her final entry, dated the day of her disappearance, was chillingly brief. "He's here. He knows. I can't escape him. He wants to keep me here forever." My blood ran cold. "He? Who is he?" Jessica gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the laptop screen. "Look at the next paragraph, Michael." Michael scrolled down, his eyes scanning the text. Following the discovery of the diary, police revisited the Vance estate with renewed scrutiny. While no physical evidence of foul play was ever found, a disturbing local legend began to circulate among the townspeople. Whispers of a dark presence in the Vance house, a malevolent spirit dating back generations, were recounted by several longtime residents. One particularly unsettling tale spoke of a former groundskeeper, a man named Silas Blackwood, who was rumored to have practiced dark arts and had an unnatural obsession with the Vance family, particularly the women. The growling sound intensified, now accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to vibrate directly inside our skulls. The air grew impossibly colder, and I could see my own breath misting in front of me. "Silas Blackwood," Jessica repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Could he be the he she was talking about? "An unnatural obsession with the Vance family, particularly the women," Michael muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. And Eleanor's diary said, "He wants to keep me here forever." What if Silas Blackwood wasn't just a groundskeeper? What if he was something else? Something that trapped her? The idea was horrifying. We had assumed Eleanor Vance was the ghost, the source of the haunting. But what if she was a victim? Trapped not by the house itself but by another more sinister entity? And by disturbing her, by speaking her name, had we not only brought her to us but also awakened whatever had held her captive? David, who had been huddled on the floor, suddenly let out a strangled cry. He pointed a shaking hand towards the hallway leading to his bedroom. The shadow. We all turned, our hearts hammering against our ribs. There, at the end of the dimly lit hallway, a figure began to coalesce. It wasn't a solid form, but a deeper absence of light, a shifting, undulating darkness that seemed to absorb the faint glow from the living room. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its outline seemed to waver, like heat haze off asphalt. It was the negative space of a man, a void given form, and it was slowly, deliberately moving towards us. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting the wallpaper behind it. A profound sense of dread washed over us, far deeper than the fear we had felt from Eleanor's furious poltergeist activity. This was different. This was ancient. This was pure, unadulterated evil. This was Silas Blackwood, and he was coming for us. The growling reached a crescendo, a terrifying roar that shook the very foundations of the apartment. The lights went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness, save for the faint, flickering glow of Michael's laptop screen. In that brief, terrifying illumination, I saw the shadow figure lurch forward, its form elongating, its reach extending. We had found Eleanor Vance, but we had inadvertently disturbed a far greater evil. We hadn't just brought a ghost home, we had brought him home too. And he was not alone. He had brought his captive, Eleanor, with him. And now he wanted us. He wanted to add us to his collection. Our nightmare was just beginning. Our nightmare was just beginning. The realization hit us like a physical blow, a cold, crushing weight that settled deep in our chests. We hadn't just stumbled upon a haunted house. We had disturbed an ancient, malevolent force, and in our ignorance, we had given it an open invitation into our lives, into our home. The terror of a simple ghost paled in comparison to the chilling truth. We were now prey, marked for a collection we couldn't even begin to comprehend. The air in the living room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It wasn't just the cold we'd felt before. This was an oppressive chill that seemed to seep into our bones, making our teeth chatter involuntarily. The flickering lights in the house, which we'd dismissed as old wiring, now pulsed erratically, casting grotesque, dancing shadows that stretched and warped familiar objects into monstrous shapes. Michael, ever the pragmatist, was the first to try and break the spell of fear that had paralyzed us. This is impossible," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, completely devoid of its usual confidence. "There has to be a logical explanation." But even as he spoke, a low guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that wasn't animal, wasn't human, but something ancient and predatory. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, enveloping us in its menacing hum. Jessica clutched Emily tighter, burying her face in her daughter's hair, her body trembling uncontrollably. Emily surprisingly didn't cry. Her eyes, wide and unervingly calm, scanned the room, as if she could see the invisible threads of dread weaving through the air. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And he's angry." David, who had been leaning against the wall, slid down to the floor, his face pale and clammy. He looked like he was about to be sick. "The attic," he choked out, his eyes darting frantically towards the ceiling. "It started after we opened the trunk, after we touched it." He was referring to the ornate, silver-backed mirror we had found, the one we'd been so fascinated by, the one that now sat innocently on the mantelpiece, reflecting our horrified faces. As if on cue, a sharp metallic screech ripped through the silence from upstairs. It sounded like nails dragging across a chalkboard, magnified 100-fold, then abruptly ended with a deafening crash. We all flinched, our nerves frayed to breaking point. "What was that?" Jessica cried, pulling away from Emily slightly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Before anyone could answer, the mirror on the mantelpiece began to ripple, its reflection distorting. Our panicked faces stretched and warped, then slowly, terrifyingly, began to contort into something else entirely. A gaunt, skeletal face, its eyes dark pits of despair, started to emerge within the silvered glass. It was Eleanor. Her silent scream twisted her features, a silent agony that mirrored our own growing terror. But then behind her, a shadow began to coalesce, a deeper darkness within the darkness. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its form vaguely human but utterly devoid of humanity. We couldn't make out details, but the sheer malevolence emanating from it was palpable, a suffocating aura that stole the air from our lungs. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't a hallucination. This was him, the collector. And he was using Eleanor's tormented reflection as a doorway, a grotesque puppet show for his grand entrance. "We have to get out of here," Michael finally roared, snapping out of his stupor. He grabbed Jessica's arm, pulling her and Emily towards the front door. David scrambled to his feet, his legs unsteady, but his instinct for self-preservation kicked in. We surged forward, a desperate, scrambling mass of fear-driven adrenaline. But the house, it seemed, had other plans. As Michael reached for the doorknob, it twisted violently in his hand, then jammed, refusing to budge. He pulled, he pushed, he rattled it with all his might, but it was useless. The door was locked, sealed shut by an unseen force. Panic, raw and unadulterated, began to set in. We were trapped. A chilling whisper slithered through the air, right next to Michael's ear, though no one was standing there. It was a voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement, ancient and brittle, yet full of a terrifying, possessive hunger. "Mine," it hissed, "all mine." The lights in the house, which had been flickering, suddenly went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. A collective gasp of terror escaped our lips. The sudden absence of light was more disorienting than the flickering had been, leaving us blind and vulnerable. We could hear each other breathing, ragged and desperate, the frantic thumping of our own hearts echoing in the oppressive silence. And then a new sound began. It was a slow, deliberate drip, 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 coming from the kitchen. We knew somehow it wasn't a leaky faucet. This was a sound designed to unnerve, to draw us in, to torment. Then a low, mournful moan echoed from upstairs, a sound so filled with sorrow and despair that it pierced through our fear, replacing it with a profound sense of pity. It was Eleanor. She was calling to us, her suffering a beacon in the darkness. "Eleanor," Emily whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the darkness. "She sounds sad." Jessica tightened her grip on Emily, trying to shield her from the horror, but the child's unusual calm was unsettling. It was as if she understood something we didn't, or felt something beyond our adult comprehension. Michael fumbled for his phone, the screen a beacon of blue light in the suffocating black. He turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, momentarily illuminating the terror etched on our faces. The kitchen, when he pointed the light, appeared normal, but the dripping sound had stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sound itself. Then a faint, almost imperceptible scratching began, coming from inside the walls. It was rhythmic, persistent, like something trying to claw its way out. It moved from the living room across the ceiling towards the kitchen, then down the wall, as if tracing a path around us. It was playing with us, a cat with a mouse, enjoying our fear. David, who had been surprisingly quiet, suddenly pointed a trembling finger towards the hallway. "Look," he croaked, his voice choked with fear. The light from Michael's phone beam followed David's gaze. There, at the far end of the hallway, a faint, shimmering outline began to appear. It was a human figure, transparent and ethereal, yet undeniably present. It was Eleanor. She stood there, her head bowed, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she seemed to be holding something. As we watched, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, or where her eyes should have been, were hollow and empty, yet they seemed to bore directly into us. Her lips moved, forming words we couldn't hear, a silent plea or a warning. Then she raised her hands, revealing what she held. It was a small, tarnished silver locket, the same locket we had seen in her portrait at the abandoned house, the very one we suspected belonged to her. But as she held it up, it pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, and the light seemed to emanate not from the locket itself, but from within it. And as the green light pulsed, the air around Eleanor began to shimmer, distorting her form. Suddenly, her image flickered, then vanished entirely, replaced by a much darker, denser shadow. This shadow was not transparent like Eleanor. It was a void, a hole in reality. It solidified, growing taller, broader, until it loomed in the hallway, an impossibly tall, skeletal figure. The collector. He didn't have a face, just a swirling vortex of darkness where his features should have been. But we felt his gaze, a cold, dissecting stare that seemed to strip away our very essence. And then he spoke. His voice was no longer a whisper, but a resonant, multi-layered sound that seemed to come from the very fabric of the house itself. It was a chorus of agony, a symphony of lost souls, all speaking in unison, yet distorted into one terrifying pronouncement. "You brought me home." Each word was drawn out, heavy with ancient power and an undeniable sense of triumph. "And now you belong to me." The temperature in the house plummeted even further, frost forming on the inside of the windows. Our breath plumed in front of our faces. The light from Michael's phone began to flicker, its beam weakening, as if the darkness itself was trying to consume it. We were trapped, frozen in terror, facing an entity that defied all logic, all reason. The collector took a step forward, a long gliding movement that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Another step, and another. He was advancing on us, slowly, deliberately, savoring our fear. The floorboards didn't creak under his weight, but the very air around him seemed to crackle with malevolent energy. "What does he want?" Jessica whimpered, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes glued to the advancing shadow. Emily, still eerily calm, looked up at her mother. "He wants to keep us," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Like Eleanor. He wants to put us in his house forever." The collector paused, as if appreciating Emily's chilling insight. Then, a new sound emerged from the vortex that was his face. It was a low, mournful cry like a child weeping, but it wasn't Eleanor. This was a different voice, younger, more innocent, filled with an unimaginable sadness. It was a sound designed to break our hearts, to fill us with a desperate, crushing empathy. And with that sound, the hallway behind the collector began to shimmer, and faint, translucent figures started to appear. They were vague, indistinct shapes, but there were many of them. Dozens. Hundreds. All trapped, all crying. He wasn't just collecting souls. He was collecting agony, and he had an entire collection already. Eleanor was just one of many, and now he wanted us to join them. The sheer scale of his malevolence, the terrifying realization of how many lives he had already consumed, was almost too much to bear. Michael, despite his terror, found a sliver of defiance. He clutched his phone tighter, the weakening beam of light a desperate shield. "No," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "We won't let you." The collector tilted his head, a gesture of amusement that was infinitely more terrifying than any roar. The chorus of voices from his face grew louder, swirling into a cacophony of despair and sadistic laughter. He raised a hand, a long shadowy appendage, and pointed it directly at Emily. "The child," the collective voices hissed, "she sees. She understands. She will be a magnificent addition." Before we could react, the air around Emily began to vibrate. Her hair stood on end, and a faint blue aura flickered around her small body. She gasped, her eyes widening, not in fear, but in a sudden, overwhelming comprehension. Then from the corners of the room, from the shadows under the furniture, from cracks in the walls, tiny dark tendrils began to emerge, snaking their way towards her like grasping, shadowy fingers. They were reaching for Emily, drawn by her unique sensitivity, by the light she possessed, a light the collector craved for his eternal darkness. Our worst fears were confirmed. He wasn't just a ghost. He was a harvester of souls, and he saw Emily as his most prized possession. Our fight for survival had just become a race against an unimaginable evil, for the soul of an innocent. The air in the living room grew thick with a silence colder than any winter night. The words "harvester of souls" hung in the space, a chilling echo that resonated deep within our bones. Michael was the first to break the agonizing quiet, his voice a strained whisper. He asked what we were all thinking, a question that felt absurd even as it formed on his lips. What even is that? A demon? Something worse?" Jessica pulled Emily closer, her eyes wide with a terror I hadn't seen before. Emily, frail and pale, shivered uncontrollably, her gaze distant, as if she were already half gone. David, usually the voice of reason, the one who sought logical explanations for everything, simply stared at the flickering candlelight, his face a mask of utter despair. The scientific mind had no framework for this. There was no equation, no theory, no observable phenomenon to explain a being that sought to consume the very essence of a person. We tried to talk, to rationalize, to plan, but every word felt hollow. How do you fight something that isn't after your life, but your soul? Our previous attempts, the salt, the sage, the desperate prayers whispered into the void now felt like childish games. We had been playing with fire, and now we were facing an inferno, armed with nothing but a squirt gun. The entity, no longer bound by the pretense of a simple haunting, wasted no time in demonstrating its true nature. The house, our sanctuary, became a living nightmare. It wasn't just the cold spots anymore, or the whispers that danced at the edge of hearing. It became a symphony of terror, orchestrated specifically for Emily. One evening, as we sat huddled together, trying to force down some dinner, the lights in the kitchen began to flicker violently. Not just dimming but flashing, strobing like a faulty strobe light at a macabre party. Then the refrigerator door, which we had meticulously taped shut, slowly creaked open. Inside, every item was coated in a thick black mold that hadn't been there moments before. It pulsed almost imperceptibly, as if alive. Emily let out a small choked cry, pointing a trembling finger. From the depths of the mold something shifted, something watched us. It wasn't an eye, but the impression of one, forming and dissolving in the fungal mass. The stench that erupted from the fridge was indescribable. A mix of decay, ozone, and something ancient and malevolent. We slammed the door shut, but the message was clear. It was inside, everywhere, and it was actively defiling our space, trying to break our spirit. Emily's health deteriorated rapidly. She was sleeping less, plagued by nightmares that left her screaming, drenched in sweat, utterly exhausted. She spoke of shadows that danced at the foot of her bed, of hands that reached out from the walls, not to grab her, but to stroke her face, leaving an icy trail that lingered for hours. She started seeing things even when she was awake, fleeting glimpses of a gaunt, skeletal figure in peripheral vision, a flicker of movement in a dark corner that vanished when she turned her head. Her appetite vanished, her skin grew translucent, and her eyes, once bright and full of life, now held a deep, unsettling sadness, as if she were mourning something she hadn't yet lost. We tried to keep her spirits up, to distract her, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. Every laugh felt forced, every smile a painful grimace. The entity seemed to feed on her fear, on her despair, growing stronger with each passing moment of her suffering. Michael, in a desperate attempt to find any kind of defense, started researching. He wasn't looking for ghost stories anymore. He was delving into ancient texts, forgotten folklore, occult practices. He spent hours hunched over his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen's harsh glow, searching for anything, a ritual, a symbol, a forgotten name that could offer even a sliver of hope against a soul harvester. David surprisingly joined him. The former skeptic was now utterly convinced, driven by a desperate need to protect Emily, whom he had always treated like a younger sister. They stumbled upon fragmented references in obscure texts, old European grimoires, Native American legends, even some ancient Egyptian scrolls that spoke of entities that transcended the simple concept of death. These beings weren't ghosts, they were something else entirely. They were parasites feeding on life energy, on emotions, on the very essence of consciousness. Some texts called them umbra, others psychovores, but the descriptions were chillingly consistent. They were drawn to purity, to innocence, because those souls offered the most potent sustenance. Emily, with her gentle nature and unwavering optimism, was a beacon to such a creature. One night, Michael found a particularly disturbing passage in a digitized medieval manuscript. It spoke of a specific type of entity, a whispering scourge, that didn't just consume souls, but harvested them, keeping them intact, imprisoned within itself, to prolong its own unnatural existence. The passage detailed how these scourges would leave a mark on their chosen victim, a spiritual tether that grew stronger with time, slowly draining the victim's life force and sanity until the soul was ripe for plucking. We looked at Emily. We had seen no physical mark, no tattoo or scar. But then we remembered the strange, almost imperceptible discoloration on her wrist, a faint swirling pattern that looked like a bruise but never faded. It had appeared a few days after the initial encounters in the house, a subtle, almost purplish hue that we dismissed as a minor bump or scrape. Now, looking at the faded illustration in the manuscript, a knot formed in my stomach. The mark depicted was an almost exact match to the faint discoloration on Emily's wrist. It was a swirling, almost fractal design, like a miniature galaxy trapped beneath her skin. Panic flared. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a slow, deliberate consumption. The entity wasn't just trying to take her soul. It was already claiming it, piece by agonizing piece. The mark was a brand, a claim tag. Jessica, seeing the horror on our faces, started to cry. What does it mean? Can we remove it? Michael, his voice heavy with dread, read further. The mark, once set, cannot be physically removed. It is a spiritual anchor. Only by severing the connection to the scourge itself, or by destroying the scourge, can the soul be freed before it is fully absorbed. The weight of those words pressed down on us. Severing the connection? Destroying a soul harvester? We didn't even know what it was, let alone how to fight it. Every passing hour felt like a minute ticking away on a doomsday clock. Emily's fragile grip on reality was slipping, her laughter replaced by hollow stares, her dreams by waking nightmares. The entity's presence in the house became almost tangible. We felt its gaze, a cold, predatory focus that never wavered. Lights would shatter for no reason. Doors would slam, not with a bang, but with a deliberate, echoing thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, thick with despair and the scent of decay. We were living in its lair, and Emily was its prey. One night, as Emily slept fitfully, whimpering in her sleep, Michael noticed something new, something terrifying. The faint, purplish mark on her wrist was no longer faint. It glowed with a soft, internal luminescence, pulsing faintly, like a tiny, malevolent heart. And as it pulsed, a thin, almost invisible tendril of shadow seemed to emanate from it, stretching out, snaking across the bed, and disappearing into the wall. It was a conduit, a siphon. The entity wasn't just marking her. It was actively feeding from her, drawing her essence through that glowing symbol. We watched in horrified silence, utterly helpless, as the light on Emily's wrist pulsed, a silent, macabre rhythm. Our home was no longer a refuge, it was a hunting ground. And we, the hunters who had sought out a ghost, had become the hunted. trapped in a desperate struggle against an ancient, unknowable evil that was slowly, methodically, devouring the soul of an innocent. The race against time had just become a desperate, agonizing vigil as we watched the life drain from Emily, knowing that the mark on her wrist was the key to her ultimate demise, and we had no idea how to break its hold. Emily's breath was shallow, her skin taking on an alarming pallor. The vibrant energy that usually pulsed through her had been replaced by a terrifying stillness, punctuated only by the weak rise and fall of her chest. The mark on her wrist, a stark, angry red, seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible light, as if drawing strength from her fading life force. Michael knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Her skin was clammy, cold. David paced frantically, his phone pressed to his ear, rattling off symptoms to an increasingly exasperated emergency dispatcher, who kept insisting they needed to bring her in, completely missing the unexplainable nature of her illness. Jessica, her face streaked with tears, was frantically sifting through every piece of research material they had amassed: journals, photos, audio transcripts, anything that might contain a hidden clue. "They don't understand, David," she cried, slamming a dusty book down on the table. "They think it's a fever, some kind of infection. They won't grasp that this isn't natural." David hung up, running a hand through his hair, his eyes wide with fear. "They're sending an ambulance, but they're going to treat the symptoms, not the cause. We have maybe hours, Jess, before they take her, before they pump her full of something that might make it worse, or just won't work at all." Michael looked up, his voice hoarse. "We can't let them take her. Not yet. We have to find something. The mark? The ritual. Ring the soul of an innocent." He repeated the chilling phrase, as if speaking it aloud might unravel its dark meaning. The air in the house felt heavy, charged. It wasn't just the tension of their fear. There was a palpable coldness that seemed to emanate from Emily's room, a subtle creeping chill that raised the hairs on their arms. It felt like the entity, whatever it was closer now, watchful, savoring its victory. Jessica snatched up a magnifying glass, poring over the faded, hand-drawn symbols from the journal they'd found in the forgotten attic room. The symbols, they're not just decorative, they're a language, a code. And this one, she pointed to a jagged, almost star-like emblem, strikingly similar to the one etched on Emily's wrist, albeit far more intricate in the journal. It appears repeatedly, always next to passages about binding and offering. Binding what? Offering what? David demanded, leaning over her shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's not just a binding," Michael interjected, his mind racing, trying to connect fragmented pieces of information. "Remember that old local legend about the Whispering Woods curse? The one about the family that vanished, leaving only a single withered tree behind? The story said they were bound to the earth, their spirits trapped, unable to move on." Jessica looked up, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Yes, but that was just a campfire story, wasn't it? Something to scare kids. What if it wasn't?" Michael pressed. "What if the entity isn't just taking Emily's life, but trapping her, wringing her soul not just to steal it, but to anchor it, to make it part of its domain, its power?" The thought was horrifying. Not just death, but eternal servitude, a ghostly existence tied to this malevolent force. It made the stakes infinitely higher. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy. David pulled up every historical archive he could find on the local area, searching for any mention of strange disappearances, unexplained illnesses, or unusual rituals. Jessica, with her keen eye for detail, was painstakingly comparing symbols from various cultures, hoping to find a linguistic or occult parallel that might shed light on the entity's nature. Michael, meanwhile, focused on the few coherent passages they had managed to decipher from the journal. "This phrase," Michael read aloud, his voice strained, "the soul shall be rung, a bell for the unseen, and its echo shall sustain the ancient hunger." "Sustain the ancient hunger," Jessica repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "It doesn't just want a soul, it needs it. It feeds on it." "And the bell for the unseen?" David mused, pacing again. "Is it a summons? A signal? Or is ringing the soul the act of making it resonate, making it audible to this entity?" Emily let out a soft moan, a sound that tore through their frantic thoughts. Michael rushed back to her side. Her lips were cracked, her eyes fluttering open weakly, glazed over with a frightening film. She tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling whisper escaped her throat. "Emily? Can you hear me?" Michael pleaded, tears stinging his eyes. Her gaze, though unfocused, seemed to settle on his face for a moment. Then with a shudder, her eyes rolled back. Her breathing became even more shallow, barely perceptible. The mark on her wrist pulsed with a brighter, more aggressive crimson. Panic seized them. "She's fading. We're losing her," Jessica cried, her voice cracking. David, usually the calmest under pressure, was visibly shaking. "The ambulance will be here any minute. We can't let them take her without knowing what we're dealing with. If this is some kind of spiritual attack, a hospital won't save her. It might just accelerate whatever is happening. We need to know how to break the binding," Michael said, his voice firm despite the terror gripping him. "How do you sever a soul from a ritual? How do you unring a bell?" Jessica, her fingers flying across the laptop keyboard, suddenly froze. "Wait, look at this." An old local newspaper clipping from 1908. The vanishing of the Blackwood family. They were the original owners of this house. It mentions unusual circumstances and a strange blight on the land. But then, look at this small, almost hidden article on page 5 from a week later. Local herbalist Mrs. Alara Thorne found deceased. Appears to have succumbed to a sudden illness. Known for her eccentric remedies and knowledge of local folklore. An herbalist? A folklorist? Michael's mind clicked. She might have known about the entity, about the rituals. "And she died shortly after the Blackwoods vanished," David added, his voice tinged with a new urgency. Coincidence? Or was she trying to help them and got too close? Jessica scrolled rapidly. Her diary. It was mentioned in a historical society inventory. Apparently, it was considered unreadable due to its archaic language and strange symbols. But it was never cataloged as lost, just inaccessible. "Where is it now?" Michael asked, a desperate hope igniting within him. The inventory says it was donated to the local historical society, but it was deemed too obscure for public display and relegated to the unprocessed archives in the old town hall basement, Jessica replied, her eyes wide. "It might still be there. Untouched. Unread." "The town hall basement," David repeated, looking at the clock. "It's almost midnight. The historical society closes at 5. We won't be able to get in until morning." "Morning might be too late," Michael said, looking at Emily's pale face. The mark on her wrist seemed to glow faintly, a malevolent beacon. "We can't wait. Not if this diary holds the key. We don't have that kind of time." A chilling wind seemed to sweep through the room, though all the windows were closed. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to brush against their ears. A sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or perhaps, something far more ancient and sinister. It was the entity they knew, reminding them of its presence, its power, its claim. It felt like a subtle warning, a cold breath against the nape of their necks, urging them to give up. But giving up was not an option. Not for Emily. "The town hall," Michael declared, his jaw set. "We're going. Now." David hesitated. "Break into the town hall? That's illegal, Michael. And what if it's a dead end? We'd be risking arrest, and Emily would still be here alone." "She won't be alone," Jessica said, her voice firm. "I'll stay. I'll monitor her, keep trying to find something else here. But you two need to go. If that diary has the answers, it's our only shot. We have to try everything." The decision was made. The desperate plan, born of terror and love, was set into motion. Michael and David, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of fear for Emily and a burgeoning fury at the unseen force stealing her life, grabbed their coats. The ambulance siren was faintly audible in the distance, a sound that usually brought relief, now filled them with dread. They had minutes, maybe less, before the authorities arrived. As they slipped out the back door, leaving Jessica alone with the rapidly fading Emily, a profound sense of isolation descended upon them. They were stepping into the heart of the night, into the unknown, chasing a century-old lead in a race against an invisible enemy. The town hall, a symbol of mundane civic order, now held the promise of an ancient, terrifying secret. The stakes had never been higher. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered warning. They were two men against an entity that defied comprehension, armed only with a desperate hope and a fading timestamp on Emily's life. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but the alternative, losing Emily, was unthinkable. The silent, moonlit streets of their quiet town suddenly felt menacing, each house a potential tomb, each whisper of wind a spectral breath. They had to find that diary. They had to. They had to find that diary. They had to. Michael's mind raced, a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and chilling possibilities. Jessica, her face pale but resolute, clutched his arm, her gaze mirroring his frantic desperation. Emily's faint, shallow breaths from the next room were a constant, agonizing reminder of the ticking clock. They had seen the entity's fury, its possessive grip on their daughter. This wasn't just a ghost story anymore. It was a battle for a soul. Where, Michael? Where would she hide it? Jessica's voice was a strained whisper, breaking the suffocating silence of their home. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the living room like a caged animal. Think. Everything we know about Sarah. She was lonely, scared. She hid the locket in the old house. It stands to reason the diary, something even more personal, something she wanted kept secret, would be there too. In her room. Or somewhere she felt safe. Jessica nodded, her eyes wide with dawning realization. But we searched her room. We turned that place upside down looking for the locket. We searched for a locket, Jessica. A small metal object. A diary. A book, even a small one, is different. He stopped, a sudden thought piercing through his haze of fear. Remember what Dr. Miller said? About Sarah's parents being distant, absorbed in their own grief after her brother passed. Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. She'd crave a place no one would think to look, a place only she knew about. A secret like her secrets. The old house. The very thought sent a shiver down their spines. It was a place of sorrow, of lingering malevolence. A place the entity now truly owned. Going back felt like walking into a predator's lair. But Emily's life hung in the balance. There was no other choice. They moved with a grim, silent determination, grabbing flashlights and the car keys. The drive was a blur of moonlit streets and oppressive quiet. Their quaint suburban town had transformed into a landscape of dread. Every shadow seemed to stretch. Every creak of the old sedan sounded like a warning. As they approached the dilapidated Victorian, it loomed against the night sky, a gaping maw of shadows and splintered wood. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. A profound chill permeated the car, making their teeth chatter. "It knows we're coming," Jessica breathed, her voice barely audible. Michael gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Then we'll face it." They parked a block away, not wanting to alert any neighbors with the familiar sound of their engine. The short walk felt endless, each step a descent deeper into an icy spiritual cold. The porch groaned under their weight as they stepped onto it, the front door, still slightly ajar from their last panicked escape, creaking open further as if inviting them in. The interior of the house was a mausoleum of dust and despair. The moonlight, filtering through grimy windows, cast long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and contort. The air was frigid, biting at their exposed skin, carrying with it the faint, cloying scent of decay and something else, something metallic like old blood. "Sarah's room," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse. They moved through the labyrinthine hallway, each floorboard protesting their intrusion with a mournful shriek. As they ascended the stairs, a cold gust of wind swept through the house, though all windows were shut. A distant, mournful sigh seemed to echo from the very walls. They reached Sarah's bedroom. It was exactly as they had left it. A desolate tableau of forgotten childhood. The broken doll still lay face down. The tattered curtains swayed in an unfelt breeze, and the air was thickest here, charged with an almost palpable malevolence. "Okay," Michael said, switching on his flashlight. Its beam cut through the gloom, illuminating swirling dust motes. "Think like Sarah. Where would she hide her deepest secrets? Not just in a drawer, not under the bed. Somewhere hidden." They began to search, methodically, desperately. Jessica ran her hands along the peeling wallpaper, feeling for loose sections, tapping the walls. Michael painstakingly checked every crevice, every dark corner. The silence of the house was punctuated only by their ragged breaths and the rustle of their clothes. Then the entity began to push back. First it was subtle. The flashlight beam flickered, dimmed, then flared again. A floorboard creaked loudly behind them, even though they were alone. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to brush against Jessica's ear. A child's voice, distorted and cold. "Did you hear that?" Jessica whirled around, her heart pounding. "Keep going," Michael urged, his own blood running cold. "It's trying to distract us." The activity escalated. A small porcelain figurine on a dusty shelf suddenly toppled over, shattering on the floor with a sharp crack that made them both jump. The air in the room dropped several degrees, and their breath plumed visibly. A heavy, antique rocking chair in the corner began to sway slowly, rhythmically, as if an invisible child were sitting in it. Michael tried to ignore it, focusing on an old, heavy wooden chest pushed against the far wall. It looked like a toy chest, but it was too large, too ornate. He tugged at it, but it wouldn't budge. He could feel eyes on him, cold and furious. Jessica, meanwhile, was examining the fireplace, its hearth long cold and filled with ash. She ran her fingers along the rough bricks. "Michael, come here." He moved to her side, his flashlight beam following her pointing finger. One of the bricks near the bottom felt slightly loose. She pushed it gently, and it shifted inward by a fraction of an inch. "A hidden alcove?" Michael murmured, his pulse quickening. This was it. This felt right. A place only a child or someone desperate for privacy would think to conceal something. As he reached for the brick, a guttural growl erupted from the shadows behind them. Not quite human, not quite animal. The rocking chair slammed violently against the wall, and the entire room vibrated with an unseen force. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over them, but Michael fought through it. "Emily!" He pulled at the brick with all his might. It resisted, as if cemented in place by an invisible hand. The growling intensified, closer now, and the air crackled with malevolent energy. Jessica whimpered, pressing herself against him, but her eyes remained fixed on the brick. "Help me!" Michael grunted, straining. Jessica, summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed, joined him, gripping the edges of the brick. Together they pulled. With a sudden sickening shudder, the brick came loose, revealing a dark, shallow cavity behind it. Inside, nestled in a layer of ancient dust, was a small leather-bound book. It was old, its cover worn smooth, clasped shut with a tarnished brass buckle. The diary. The moment Michael's fingers brushed against the leather, the house erupted. A deafening roar tore through the air, vibrating through their very bones. The remaining windows shattered inward with explosive force, sending shards of glass flying. The floorboards beneath them buckled and groaned, and the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling exploded in a shower of sparks. They were plunged into absolute darkness, save for the frantic beam of Michael's flashlight, which flickered wildly. The entity was enraged, its fury a palpable, physical force that threatened to tear the house and them apart. "Run!" Michael screamed, shoving the diary into his jacket and grabbing Jessica's hand. They stumbled out of Sarah's room, the house collapsing around them in a symphony of splintering wood and crashing plaster. The entity was a whirlwind of icy wind and guttural screams, pursuing them down the precarious staircase, its presence a suffocating weight on their backs. They could hear objects being hurled, walls groaning, the very structure groaning under the onslaught of pure, vengeful rage. They burst out of the front door, gasping for air, not daring to look back at the crumbling edifice. The night air, though still cold, was a blessed relief from the suffocating malevolence within. They ran, not caring where, just away from that house, away from the fury they had unleashed. They didn't stop until they reached their car, scrambling inside and fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life and Michael sped away, leaving the tormented house behind them, a dark, silent silhouette against the moon. Back at their own house, the quiet felt fragile, tenuous. Emily was still breathing, still lost to them but unharmed. They stood in their living room, shaken, bruised, but clutching the diary like a lifeline. Michael's hands trembled as he unbuckled the tarnished clasp. The leather groaned open, revealing yellowed pages filled with cramped, looping handwriting. The first entry was dated over a century ago. On the very first page, a crude, childlike drawing stared back at them. A stick figure of a girl alone under a weeping willow tree. Below it, scrawled in faint, faded ink, was a single chilling phrase. A name. A name that, when Michael read it aloud, would change everything they thought they knew. Michael's voice, usually so steady, cracked as he whispered the single word. Sarah. The name hung in the air, heavy and cold, like a breath on a winter morning. Jessica leaned closer, her eyes scanning the faded paper. Sarah? Who's Sarah? David, ever the pragmatist, was already reaching for his phone. Let me see if I can cross-reference this. Miller House records, local obituaries, anything from the late 70s, early 80s. His fingers flew across the screen, the only sound in the tense silence of the room. Michael and Jessica watched him, their own minds racing, trying to grasp at any connection. The air in their apartment, usually warm and familiar, felt suddenly thin, as if something vital had been siphoned away. Minutes stretched into an eternity. David's brow furrowed, his expression shifting from focused concentration to a dawning horror. Finally, he stopped typing, his hand trembling slightly as he held the phone out to them. "Guys, you need to see this." They clustered around him, their gazes fixed on the faded digital image on the screen. It was an old newspaper article, yellowed with age, dated October 1978. The headline screamed in bold, stark letters, "Local child vanishes near Willow Creek." Below it, a blurry photograph of a smiling girl with pigtails. A little girl. "Sarah Miller," David read, his voice barely above a whisper. "Age 8. Last seen playing in the woods behind her family home near Willow Creek. Authorities suspect drowning, but her body was never recovered." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Sarah Miller, age 8, last seen playing near Willow Creek. The Miller house. The abandoned house where they had found the ghost box. The house where the creek ran just beyond the overgrown yard. And the drawing. The stick figure girl under the weeping willow. Jessica felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The drawing, it's of her, isn't it? Or it was her drawing. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The weeping willow, that's a specific detail. And the creek. Everything lines up. She lived in that house. The haunted house. But it was more than just lining up. The drawing wasn't just a random sketch. It was a fragment of a lost life, a silent plea from the past. And it had been hidden inside the very object that seemed to amplify the strange occurrences. The ghost box. The device they had brought home with them. A shiver, colder than anything they'd felt before, snaked through the room. It wasn't just a cold spot. It felt like an invisible presence had just walked through them. The faint scent of damp earth, of decaying leaves and stagnant water, suddenly permeated the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, clean scent of their apartment. It was the smell of the creek bank, of the woods behind the Miller house, now somehow transported directly into their living room. "She's here," Michael breathed, the words barely audible. "She followed us." David, usually the most skeptical, didn't argue. His face was ashen. "The ghost box, we found that drawing inside the ghost box. It was a part of it. When we brought it back, we didn't just bring a device. We brought her." The implication hung like a guillotine blade. They hadn't stumbled upon a general haunting. They had inadvertently invited a specific, tragic entity into their lives. Sarah, the missing child. The girl whose body was never found. The air grew heavier, pressing down on them. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushed past Michael's ear. It wasn't coherent, just a fleeting wisp of sound like a child's sigh. He instinctively recoiled, a primal fear seizing him. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, looking from Jessica to David. Jessica was already clutching her arms, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I felt something like a cold breath on my neck." Then a soft, rhythmic tapping began. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, coming from the kitchen. Asterisk tap, tap, tap. Asterisk, like a small finger gently knocking against a surface. They froze, their eyes locked on the kitchen doorway. David, summoning a courage he didn't feel, slowly moved towards the kitchen, Michael and Jessica right behind him. The tapping stopped the moment they entered. The kitchen was empty, the sink sparkling, the counters clear. Nothing seemed out of place. But then Jessica gasped, pointing a trembling finger. On the pristine white surface of the kitchen island, a faint, muddy footprint had appeared. It was small, too small for any of them. A child's footprint. And it was still slightly damp, leaving a faint trail of wet earth. The smell of creek water intensified, becoming almost overwhelming. Michael felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with pure terror. This wasn't a trick of the light, or a shared hallucination. This was real. Sarah was here. And she was making her presence known in a way that left no room for doubt. "She's trying to tell us something," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "Or she's angry. Or scared." David's eyes scanned the kitchen, searching for any other anomaly. Her body was never found. What if she didn't just drown? What if something else happened to her? The thought sent a fresh wave of chills through them. A child's disappearance, her body never recovered. It hinted at something far more sinister than a tragic accident. The idea that Sarah wasn't a malicious spirit, but a lost, perhaps wronged child trying to communicate her truth, was both heartbreaking and terrifying. They retreated from the kitchen, the muddy footprint a chilling testament to Sarah's tangible presence. Back in the living room, a small porcelain doll, one that had belonged to Jessica as a child and had been packed away in a box in the attic for years, now sat upright on the coffee table. Its glassy eyes stared blankly ahead, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge of dirt on its cheek. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "My doll. I haven't touched that in decades. How did it get down here?" The implication was clear. Sarah, the child ghost, was interacting with the child's toy. Her toy perhaps, or a way to connect with Jessica, who once was a child herself. Michael felt a cold, hard knot of fear tightening in his stomach. They had sought out a mystery, a thrill, a story, but they had found something far more profound and far more dangerous. They had found a lost soul, and in their curiosity, they had opened a door that now seemed impossible to close. The ghost box lay on the table, inert, its red light off. But its purpose, its connection to Sarah, was now terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just a device for picking up stray energies. It was a conduit, a bridge for Sarah to cross from her world to theirs. And they had carried that bridge right into their home. "We need to find out what really happened to her," Michael declared, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "Her body was never found. That means there's an unresolved truth. Maybe that's why she's here. Maybe she wants us to find it." David, still pale, nodded slowly. "It's the only logical explanation for why she's so active now. We found her name, we found her drawing. We're getting closer to her story. And she wants us to keep going." But Jessica looked at them, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and growing desperation. "And what if finding out the truth just makes it worse? What if what happened to her was unspeakable? What if we stir up something far more dangerous than just a lost child?" Her words hung heavy in the air, a chilling premonition. The thought that Sarah's disappearance wasn't an isolated tragedy, but a piece of a larger, darker puzzle, sent a fresh wave of terror through them. If Sarah was trying to communicate a truth that had been buried for decades, what kind of truth could it be? And who would want it to remain hidden? The apartment grew colder still. A faint, almost melodic hum began, emanating from the ghost box itself, even though it was switched off. It was a low vibrational sound like a forgotten lullaby. And then slowly, agonizingly, the red light on the ghost box flickered on, illuminating the worn, smudged drawing of the stick figure girl under the weeping willow. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times in sync with the soft, unseen hum. And as it pulsed, they all heard it, clear as day, a child's voice, faint but distinct, whispering from the device. "Help me." The words echoed in the suddenly frigid room, a desperate plea from beyond the veil. The hum intensified, the red light bathing their faces in an eerie glow. Sarah wasn't just a presence anymore. She was a voice, a plea, and they were caught in the middle of her unfinished story, a story that was now demanding to be heard. The mystery had deepened, and with it, the stakes had risen to an unbearable height. They were no longer just observers, they were participants, unwillingly entangled in a decades-old tragedy that had followed them home, seeking its resolution. And they knew with a certainty that chilled them to their very souls, that there was no turning back now. And they knew with a certainty that chilled them to their very souls, that there was no turning back now. The house, once a symbol of their shared dreams, had become a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the eaves, was amplified, twisting into the phantom sounds of a presence that was now undeniably, terrifyingly real. Sleep became a luxury none of them could afford or even achieve. Michael, usually the picture of stoicism, walked with a permanent slump to his shoulders, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. Jessica, often the most sensitive, was a raw nerve, flinching at shadows, her face pale and drawn. David, whose initial skepticism had given way to outright terror, found himself jumping at his own reflection, his mind racing with frantic, unformed escape plans. Emily, ever the pragmatist, was the only one who seemed to channel her fear into a desperate, almost manic energy, poring over old maps and local history books as if the answers might leap from the yellowed pages. The manifestations grew bolder, more frequent. It wasn't just cold spots anymore. It was the distinct chill of a breath on the back of your neck when no one was near. It wasn't just flickering lights. It was objects gently, deliberately shifting position, sometimes right before their eyes. A child's porcelain doll, forgotten in a dusty corner of the attic, would appear on the kitchen counter. A stack of old photo albums, stored away for years, would be found open to a specific faded picture of a young woman they didn't recognize. The whispers intensified, no longer just indistinct murmurings, but fragmented syllables, just beyond the grasp of full comprehension, echoing with a profound sorrow. One night, Jessica woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. She'd seen it, clearer than ever before. A young woman, not menacing but utterly desolate, standing by their living room window, her hands pressed against the glass as if trying to break through an invisible barrier. The woman was wearing a simple, old-fashioned dress, and around her neck, a tarnished silver locket. Jessica's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew with an instinct that bypassed logic that this was the entity that had followed them, the ghost of their house. They couldn't run. That much was clear. The presence wasn't tied to the old mill or the woods. It was tied to them, or perhaps to something within their home. It had followed them, and it wouldn't let them go until its purpose was fulfilled. Their only option, terrifying as it was to find out what it wanted. Emily had already started her research, fueled by strong coffee and a desperate need for answers. She'd spent days at the local historical society, sifting through microfiche, old town records, and dusty newspaper archives. Michael, despite his exhaustion, helped her, his methodical mind trying to piece together the disparate fragments of the past. David, still largely paralyzed by fear, would occasionally offer a trembling suggestion, while Jessica, through her growing sensitivity to the spiritual presence, provided invaluable, albeit unsettling, insights. Then Emily found it, tucked away in a 1968 edition of the local Sentinel, a small, almost insignificant article on page 7. Local girl Eleanor Vance disappears without a trace. The headline was dismissive, the tone suggesting a runaway, a flighty teenager. But the accompanying photo, a grainy black and white portrait, showed the same young woman Jessica had seen in her dream, the same quiet, haunted eyes. Eleanor Vance, 19 years old, described as quiet, artistic, and a bit rebellious for her time. She lived with her strict aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Elias Thorne, whose property, as Emily realized with a jolt, encompassed the very land their house now stood on. The article mentioned a brief police investigation, quickly closed due to lack of leads. No body was ever found. Just a note, supposedly left by Eleanor, expressing a desire to seek a new life. A new life, Michael scoffed, pointing to the article. Or a convenient excuse to stop looking. Jessica, clutching the faded newspaper clipping, felt a wave of profound sadness wash over her. She didn't run away, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She couldn't have. She's here. She's been here all along. The locket. Jessica remembered her dream, the locket around Eleanor's neck. Michael suddenly recalled something. When we first started clearing the garden, he said slowly, near that old oak tree by the creek bed, I dug up this old, tarnished silver locket. It was empty. I thought it was just junk. Tossed it in a box in the garage. A frantic search ensued. They tore through boxes of forgotten tools, old paint cans, and gardening supplies in the dimly lit garage. Finally, Michael's hand closed around a small, heavy object. It was the locket, tarnished almost black with age, but unmistakably the one from Jessica's vision. It had a delicate, almost floral etching on its surface, and it was indeed empty. As Jessica held the locket, a chill, distinct from the ambient cold in the house, radiated from it, spreading through her hand and up her arm. She felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of despair, a crushing sense of betrayal and fear. It was as if Eleanor's last emotions had been imprinted onto the metal, waiting for someone to finally feel them. That night, the ghost's presence reached a new intensity. It wasn't just whispers now, it was a desperate plea. In the living room where they had gathered, too afraid to be alone, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of lilacs, Eleanor's favorite flower, filled the air. Then, one by one, the antique books on the old bookshelf began to slide out, seemingly pushed by an unseen hand. Not just falling but sliding as if being carefully arranged. They formed a crude arrow pointing towards the fireplace, specifically to the oldest, most weathered section of the brickwork. David, his face ashen, pointed a trembling finger. It wants us to look there. Michael, summoning every ounce of his dwindling courage, approached the fireplace. He ran his hand over the rough, cold bricks, feeling for any anomaly. One particular brick, darker than the others, felt loose. With a grunt, he pried it free. Behind it, in a small hollowed-out space, was a small leather-bound journal, brittle with age, and a single faded photograph. The photograph was of Eleanor, younger, smiling, holding a tiny, almost imperceptible bump on her stomach. Her smile was tinged with both joy and apprehension. Michael handed the journal to Emily, whose fingers trembled as she opened it. The ink was faded, the paper fragile, but Eleanor's elegant handwriting was still legible. They gathered around, their hearts pounding in unison. As Emily began to read aloud, her voice hushed with awe and dread. The journal entries painted a tragic picture. Eleanor had been secretly involved with a prominent married man in town, a respected pillar of the community, Mr. Arthur Caldwell. He was older, charming, and wielded considerable influence. Eleanor had fallen deeply in love, believing his promises of a future together, despite his marital status. But the entries grew darker. She was pregnant. Arthur, terrified of scandal, had demanded she end the pregnancy, offering money to keep her silent. Eleanor, however, had refused. She loved her unborn child and, in her desperation and growing anger, had threatened to expose him, to reveal his hypocrisy to the entire town. The last entry was dated the day she disappeared, October 12, 1968. He's agreed to meet me by the old weeping willow near the creek bed, just beyond the Thorn property line. He says he'll finally really talk about us, about the baby. I have a bad feeling, a chill that has nothing to do with the autumn air. But I have to go. For our child. I pray he does the right thing. If not, I will tell everyone. I will not be silenced. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tragedy. Eleanor hadn't run away. She had gone to meet the father of her child, a man who had everything to lose. And she had never returned. The new life note was a fabrication, a cruel lie to cover up a heinous crime. Her death had been an accident, or so the town was led to believe. But the journal revealed the chilling truth. She had been silenced, murdered, her body hidden, her story buried beneath decades of silence and deceit. The ghost of Eleanor Vance wasn't seeking revenge, not truly. She was seeking justice. She wanted her story told, her child acknowledged, and her true resting place found. She was trapped, a restless spirit unable to move on until her truth was finally revealed to the world. And they, the unwitting occupants of her former home, were her last desperate hope. The air in the living room grew heavy, almost suffocating, with a palpable sense of sorrow and desperate hope. They looked at each other, their faces etched with a profound understanding. They knew what they had to do. The old weeping willow, the creek bed, the land that held Eleanor's final secret. The climax of this decades-old tragedy was upon them, and they were no longer just haunted. They were Eleanor's chosen instruments, her last chance for peace. The air was heavy, not just with the impending storm that had been brewing for days, but with a palpable sense of destiny. Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily stood on the edge of the property, the old house looming behind them, a silent sentinel. Eleanor's presence had never been so overwhelming, a constant thrum beneath their skin, urging them forward. They carried shovels and a flashlight, their faces grim, resolved. This was it, the final act. They moved like automatons drawn by an invisible current, past the decaying porch, through the overgrown yard, towards the gnarled silhouette of the weeping willow. Its branches, usually swaying mournfully, seemed to reach out, beckoning, almost guiding them. The creek bed, swollen from recent rains, gurgled ominously nearby. The ground around the willow was soft, damp, and disturbed in places, as if the earth itself was restless, desperate to yield its burden. A cold gust of wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the faint, chilling scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient. Michael felt a jolt, an undeniable pull towards a specific spot near the base of the willow, where one of its thickest roots snaked towards the creek. The others felt it too, their eyes locking with his. Without a word, they began to dig. The shovels bit into the yielding soil, the rhythmic scraping and thudding the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. Every scoop felt like an act of profound importance, a chipping away at decades of forgotten sorrow. Eleanor's presence intensified, a cold breath on their necks, a whisper in the rustling leaves. It wasn't menacing now, but desperate, a plea. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Sweat beaded on Michael's forehead despite the chill. Then David's shovel hit something solid with a dull clang. Everyone froze. The air crackled with anticipation. David dropped to his knees, frantically scraping away the dirt with his hands. Slowly, a dark rectangular shape emerged. It was a metal box, heavily rusted, its edges softened by time and earth, but undeniably a container. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jessica's eyes were wide, fixed on the box, a mixture of terror and awe etched on her face. Michael reached down, his fingers trembling, and carefully lifted the heavy casket of secrets from its earthen tomb. The moment it cleared the ground, a profound stillness descended. The wind died. The creek's gurgle faded. Eleanor's presence, so overwhelming moments before, seemed to coalesce, to focus entirely on the box in Michael's hands. He placed it gently on the damp grass. The rust was so thick that the latch was completely fused. David retrieved a small pry bar from his bag, and with a grunt of effort, he forced it open. A faint, musty scent, like old paper and decaying metal, wafted out. Inside, nestled amongst layers of preserved, brittle cloth, were 3 items. A small, tarnished silver locket, its delicate chain broken. A faded blue ribbon, almost certainly from a child's hair. And beneath them, carefully folded, a single yellowed sheet of paper. Michael's hand shook as he reached for the paper. It was old, fragile, and the ink had bled in places, but the handwriting, small and childish, was still legible. It was a letter. Eleanor's letter. He unfolded it with excruciating care, the others leaning in, their breath held captive in their chests. Emily pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the fading script. Michael began to read aloud, his voice a strained whisper. "Mama, Papa, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. The storm came so fast when I was by the creek. I slipped on the wet rocks. My head hit hard. Everything went dark for a little while. When I woke up, the water was so cold, and my leg hurt so bad. I tried to call for you, Papa, but the water was too loud. I couldn't move. I saw you running towards me. Mama was behind you crying. You pulled me out, Papa. You carried me. I was so cold. I think I broke something. You laid me down under the big willow where we always play. You told Mama to go get help, but she just cried. You kept saying, 'No one can know, Eleanor. No one can know.' I heard you tell Mama it was an accident, that they would blame us. You said we had to make it look like I ran away. I tried to tell you I was still there, Papa, but my voice was so weak. You hugged me so tight, so very tight. I felt sleepy. I think I'm going to sleep now. Don't be sad, Mama. Don't be sad, Papa. I love you. I wish I didn't fall. I wish I could go to school tomorrow. My doll Betsy is still by the creek. Please find her. Please don't forget me. Eleanor." The last word hung in the air, a phantom echo of a child's final plea. Michael finished reading, his throat tight with emotion. Jessica sobbed openly, tears streaming down her face. David's jaw was clenched, his eyes glistening. Emily was openly weeping, her hand clamped over her mouth. The truth, far more tragic and human than any monstrous haunting, settled upon them. Eleanor hadn't been murdered by a stranger, or maliciously hidden away. She had died in a terrible accident, and her grief-stricken, terrified father had buried her to protect his family, believing the authorities would blame them. He had chosen to erase her existence rather than face the devastating consequences of her accidental death, forcing his wife into complicity, burying not just his daughter, but the truth, and with it Eleanor's peace. As Michael carefully refolded the letter, a profound shift occurred. The suffocating weight in the air lifted. The chilling presence that had plagued them for weeks, that had screamed and wept and manipulated, simply vanished. It wasn't a dramatic surge of light, or a sudden gust of wind. It was an absence, a void where something powerful had once been. Eleanor was gone, not gone from memory, but gone from her earthly tether. She had finally been heard. She had finally found her peace. The silence that followed was deafening, yet strangely comforting. The house, when they looked back at it, no longer seemed to glower. It stood, a quiet old structure, its secrets laid bare. They stood there for a long time, the box with its heartbreaking contents held reverently, the weight of their discovery heavy in their hands. The immediate terror was gone, replaced by a profound sadness and a sense of solemn responsibility. "We have to tell someone," Jessica whispered, her voice hoarse. Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the quiet landscape. "We have to give her a proper burial. Let her rest." The next few days were a blur of activity. They contacted the local authorities, presenting the box, the letter, and their unbelievable story. Skepticism was immediate, but the physical evidence, combined with Michael and Jessica's unwavering conviction, and the documented history of strange occurrences in the house, eventually led to an investigation. Forensics confirmed the age of the items. Local historical records were scoured, cross-referencing names and dates, confirming the existence of Eleanor and her parents, their sudden departure, and the widespread, unresolved mystery of her disappearance. Word spread through the small town like wildfire. The old, forgotten tragedy of Eleanor Vance became a cold case solved, not by detectives, but by the desperate plea of a ghost and the courage of 4 people who dared to listen. The elderly parents, long since passed, were posthumously implicated, their desperate act of concealment finally brought to light. There was no justice to be served against them, only a tragic understanding of the human capacity for fear and grief. A quiet, dignified ceremony was held. Eleanor Vance, finally acknowledged, finally mourned, was laid to rest in the town cemetery, decades after her young life had ended. Michael and Jessica, David and Emily were all there. The weeping willow still stood, a silent witness, but its branches no longer seemed to weep. Back at the house, a palpable sense of calm had settled. The cold spots were gone. The whispers had ceased. The unsettling feeling that had permeated every corner of their home had vanished, replaced by a quiet, almost gentle atmosphere. The house was theirs now, truly theirs, free from the echoes of a child's lonely sorrow. Michael and Jessica discussed selling, but somehow the thought felt wrong. They had been chosen, used as instruments of peace. The house had become more than just bricks and mortar. It was a testament to a journey, a place where a profound truth had been unearthed. They decided to stay. They renovated not to erase the past, but to honor it, to make it a home filled with warmth and life, a stark contrast to the cold, silent tomb it had once been. They even planted a small memorial garden near the creek, a quiet tribute to Eleanor. David and Emily remained close friends, forever bound by the extraordinary events they had shared. They often visited, and the house felt different to them too, a place of quiet history, not lingering terror. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustled through the leaves of the old willow, Michael would think of Eleanor. He would wonder if, in the quiet rustling, she was simply saying thank you. He had learned that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and that the past, no matter how deeply hidden, always finds a way to demand its due. He and Jessica had found the ghost, yes, but in truth, Eleanor had found them. And in doing so, she had not only found her peace, but had irrevocably changed the course of their lives, reminding them that even in the darkest corners of history, there is always a chance for truth, for empathy, and for a final quiet rest.